Hello, this is Professor Kent Lee. Welcome back to this video series on understanding your field of study and thus writing in your field. In order to better understand your field, we're going to take maybe linguistics as an example. It's my field and it's what some of you may be familiar with. If you're watching this video, you might have had a linguistics course or course in English as a second language, foreign language classes of some kind, and so this is somewhat understandable for most of you. Let's do a thought experiment in order to just understand academic research and writing. Let's do a thought experiment. I want you to imagine that you're in an alternate universe, an alternate reality, where some of the great minds of linguistics just didn't do what they did. Maybe they became business people and did something else or whatever. And let's say the years, I don't know, 1920, 1940, in this alternate timeline, this different universe. And so modern linguistics just never arose as a special field. There are no linguists, academic linguists. And you're a professor at the top university in your country. And the government of your country realizes that there's a major need for understanding language and languages for people in your country to do international business, for government specialists, for language education, teaching, translation, etc. Your government realizes there is a desperate need for understanding language and languages for a number of reasons. And so the government has said your university needs to put together a new department to study and do research on language to help us so our country can prosper. So you are one of a group of professors from different departments. Universities called you together and say, okay, you're going to set up a new department to study language, start a new scientific study of language. Call it linguistics. Okay. So what do? First of all, your university needs to know, okay, what kind of research you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and then partly on that, where is this department going to be classified? The university needs to know. I mean, should it be part of an existing department like psychology, sociology, English literature, comparative literature? Should it be a separate department? If so, should it be in the social sciences? Should it be in the humanities? Should it be biology? Where does it belong? So you need to figure out how you're going to study language and thus where the field belongs. Probably it's going to be a separate department, but where? So you and your fellow professors in this new department are going to have to figure out, okay, how are we going to approach the study of human language for all these various needs and purposes? Depending on your backgrounds and interests, you're going to ask maybe different questions about what is language? How do we understand language? How do humans use language? How do we communicate? You're going to ask different kinds of questions, which are then going to affect the research in the field and the goals of the field. These are questions like the goals of the field. What is knowledge? What do we consider new knowledge and understanding of linguistics? How do we pursue such knowledge? And this is a question of what we call epistemology. Now, epistemology is a term from philosophy. And in philosophy, theoretical philosophy refers to questions of what is knowledge? What does it mean to know something? How do we know things? Like, how do we as humans know things? That's a very abstract question. But when it comes to research, it's a very important question. What are we trying to find out? What questions are we asking? How are we asking the questions? And then how are we going to pursue knowledge? How do we answer those questions? We're going to cut up people's heads and try to look for language inside? Are you going to put them through, CAT scans, CT scans, or MRIs? Are you going to interview them? Are you going to try to teach them, a bunch of real languages or maybe made up languages? Are you going to try to do computer models of language learning? I mean, what are you going to do? How are you going to study it? These all affect the kind of research you're going to do, the types of research you're going to do, and then how you communicate your findings. How are these findings going to be communicated? You're going to have a community of fellow scholars. And if you write an academic paper, that's going to be the audience of your paper. What kind of community, what kind of audience are you looking for? Those who like qualitative research or quantitative research or whatever. For whom are you doing the research? Who's going to benefit from it? Just like you should ask of your own field, what's the community in my field? If I write an academic research paper, who's it for? Who's the community? Who are the potential readers, the audience of this paper? Well, in this thought experiment, okay, who else is going to read your papers? What kind of people in government and business and education are going to be interested in the research that you and your colleagues do in this new department? Government, education, technology, business, and a number of fields. Parents even, who care about their kids' education. How is the public going to understand the field? How are they going to benefit from it? What's the social value? Like for teaching kids, for business purposes and such, what's the social value of this field? So, depending on your backgrounds, you're going to approach this different ways. If, let's say, some people in your department have a background in, say, anthropology, maybe you're going to use anthropology methods. Well, what do anthropologists do? In this case, we're talking about qualitative methods. Anthropologists might study other people groups and languages by doing what's called ethnographic research or ethnography. And that means studying people or people groups of people. So an anthropologist goes to some new people group that hasn't been studied before. For example, they try to join the community, they observe people. So they do a lot of observational study. They observe people, they observe what they do in order to understand this culture. They also do some open-ended interviews, kind of general interview questions, like getting to know people and say, okay, what kinds of things do you believe in this tribe, in this culture? Why do you believe that? What beliefs do you have about religion, about where your people came from, about what you consider good and bad, about gender roles, male and female? What are your cultural beliefs about marriage, about parents and children? All kinds of questions, all kinds of social questions you're going to ask them. So you're going to do observational studies and open-ended interview questions, largely. Well, if that's your background, you might approach language the same way, approaching language as a social phenomenon, as a means of social interaction and communication. So you might observe people learning a second language and doing observational studies, watching children learn their first language and doing observational studies. You can't really ask kids a lot of these questions, but maybe older people who are learning a second language, you can ask them questions like that. How do you feel when you're learning this? What kind of things are harder for you in the language and such like that? Or watching social interactions in a classroom and how people are learning language, even in the first language, when observing social interactions among native speakers of the language, how they communicate to each other, how they make their ideas, how they express their ideas, how they achieve their goals, how they express their intentions, how they achieve their intentions and goals in any kind of social interaction. You can do ethnographic research, and you can even take detailed notes of how they talk and their pauses and when they start and stop a sentence, when one person stops and another person starts talking, the voice pauses and the intonation. You can take very detailed notes and infer things about the interaction going on there. Now, if you're a psychologist by training and trained in scientific psychology research, maybe you're going to try to do lab experiments and come up with specific hypotheses that you can test scientifically in a lab about how people are using language, or even about what's going on inside the head, in the mind when they're using language. Maybe even using psychology experiments with equipment that measures what's going on in them to understand the structure of language and how people are using things mentally, and how language is related to other things in the mind, other mental abilities. If you are maybe trained in philosophy, maybe you're interested in things like word meanings and what words mean, and kind of semantic questions and theoretical questions. And from there, maybe start to investigate grammar in the way that Chomsky did, using theoretical methods, like what do native speakers mean when they say words like this? How do they mean such words? Theoretical questions like different word classes like nouns and verbs. Okay, how do you kind of classify these different classes and types of words in the language? What kind of things are possible in the language? In this language, like English, what kinds of things can you say? Can you say sentences like curious green ideas sleep furiously? Can you say that? Is it grammatical? Does it make sense? Or the horse raced past the barn fell? Or live mice sit on us? Can you say things like that? Do people understand those kinds of sentences? You're kind of playing theoretically with what kinds of sentences are possible or impossible in English compared to German, compared to French, compared to Korean, compared to Chinese, Japanese, etc. What means something, what is comprehensible, and what is just gibberish and nonsense in terms of the grammar and the semantics and the meaning. That's kind of more theoretical approaches. So you're doing what we might call armchair linguistics, but it has a role. It has a function. Understanding theoretically what the language is like as its own standalone mental system and the logical system of what is possible and not possible to say in the language. So, if you're more of the qualitative type, doing ethnographic and interview research, you're going to gravitate more towards qualitative research. Doing ethnographic or observational studies, doing open-ended interview studies, doing case studies where you examine, cases of language learners in detail, kind of holistic, qualitative research. That's going to be your approach, and that means you're going to write papers in a certain way where the support is based on what interviewees or participants tell you and things that you observe, kind of more observational data and self-reported data from people that you interview. That's kind of more open-ended qualitative research, and you might have apply some theory from sociology or anthropology in order to interpret and make sense of these things that you hear and observe qualitatively. You might be drawn towards quantitative research using scientific research methods, like from psychology and statistics and the scientific method to design very specific controlled experiments. Let's formulate a specific hypothesis and then let's test it using the scientific method and statistics to test things, because you value that as a scientific thinker and you want to actually prove or disprove things to really understand what's going on, especially language in the mind or other questions. If you're more for a theoretical person, you're going to use theoretical arguments, theoretical examples. This is a possible sentence. This is not a possible sentence in the language. Theoretical arguments, like a philosopher would, posing hypothetical examples, hypothetical questions, and using logical argumentation, deductive and inductive logic to arrive at conclusions. And that's how theoretical linguistics started. You might also be interested in more specific questions, like, say, reading. How do people read? And you can use scientific psychology methods to look at how people read. This is kind of a secondary function of language, where the language is primarily the spoken language, but you could look at reading. You could look at writing. You can collect lots of writing samples and do statistical analysis of patterns in writing samples. There are all kinds of different things you can do. Then, let's say you've got some linguistic theories going and you've got some body of knowledge going. You could then branch out into other kinds of research. Somebody in your department might want to do critical or evaluative research, maybe a person who's a sociologist by background studying language. And so they've got some critical theory for critiquing language, and they want to say, okay, if you look at, let's say, politicians and the way they use language, or advertisements, or educational programs, using our theories of language, are there signs of bias or discrimination in these public domains? Or when you look at certain people and how they talk about certain things, do you see signs of bias, discrimination, discriminatory, sexist, racist attitudes and such? Or let's examine educational programs and using some kind of criteria for evaluating programs. Are these programs effective? Are they achieving their goals that they claim they are trying to achieve? interpretive. Maybe a person from a literary or philosophical background tries to interpret, use linguistic tools for interpretation and translation of texts, for example. Applied research, where you kind of draw from different kinds of empirical research that's been done and then come up with new ways of, say, teaching a language. Wow, learning Hungarian is hard. How can we improve Hungarian teaching for these learners? Or teaching Chinese is really hard for adults who need to learn Chinese for business or for translation or government work. Let's look at the linguistics research and find some ideas for new teaching methods, and then let's test these new teaching methods. Applied research. And applied research can be just, okay, based on the research, this is what we should do. You can then do qualitative or quantitative studies of that kind of research. I'll talk more about that later. So this is going to affect the kind of writing. If you're doing quantitative research, your papers are going to follow a pretty strict scientific format. Introduction, literature review, your description then of the experiment of the study, and that then consists of like who participated, the materials used, how the study was carried out, how the statistical analysis was done, the mathematical statistical results, then your general discussion section where you explain everything and say we proved our hypothesis, testing a hypothesis. If you're doing qualitative research, it's going to be a much more flexible format or layout, and especially if it's more theoretical or interpretive, the layout is going to be a lot looser. That's then going to affect the kind of support that you have in your paper, and I'll talk more about that in another video. So after what I've just said, think about what kinds of things appeal more to you. What kind of interests you? Do you feel like you more like the qualitative approach? Would you be more interested in interpreting literature or interpreting political documents, evaluating something? Because that might say something about where your interests and your preferences and talents lie when it comes to courses you would take or the kinds of research papers you would like to do in a class or what you'd want to study. And right now this might seem a bit abstract. So in a couple more videos, we're going to go more into the kinds of support that you might have for these different kinds of papers, qualitative, quantitative, etc. What kind of contents do you have in the body paragraphs in order to support the ideas in the paper? And then we'll look at specific examples of research questions and hypotheses and the kinds of studies you would do to support those. Okay, so that's it for now. Brain's again probably full. Take a break, come back to the next video, and I'm going to fill your brain up with a lot more stuff. Until then, see you next time. Goodbye.